sound of battle is in the land, and of great destruction. How is the hammer of the whole earth cut asunder and broken? How is Babylon become a desolation among the nations? I've laid a snare for thee, and thou art taken, O Babylon, and thou wast not aware. Thou art found and caught, because thou hast striven against the Lord. The Lord has opened his armory, and has brought forth the weapons of his indignation. And this is the work of the Lord God of hosts, in the land of the Chaldeans. Come up against her from the uttermost border. Open her storehouses, cast her up as a heap, destroy her utterly. Let nothing of her be left. Slay all of her bullocks. Let them go down to the slaughter. Woe unto them, for their day is come, and the time of their visitation. This is BBaruch, and we are going to look at the armory of the Lord, the weapons of his indignation, which he has fashioned to use in the judgment of America, Babylon. A sound of battle will be found in the land, and of great destruction. And that word for great destruction is gadol, and it means exceedingly great, exceedingly loud, mighty, and very great destruction. How is Babylon become a desolation among the nations? The word for desolation is shama, and it means to be ruined, to become an astonishment, a desolation, an incredible thing. And it comes from the word shamem, which means to be stunned, to be utterly amazed, to be astonished at what happened. An unbelievable thing is going to happen. In 1 hour, the great Babylon, America, will lay in waste and in utter ruin. The prophecy in the book of Revelation, chapter 18, speaks to the same hour. Merchants of the earth will stand off. They'll stand far off for fear of the torment which has come upon Babylon, America. And they'll be weeping and wailing. And they'll be crying out, alas, alas, the mighty nation that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, and decked with gold and precious stones. In 1 hour, such great riches have come to nothing. And every shipmaster and all of those that trade by the sea will stand far off, and they will cry when they see the smoke of her burning, crying out, what nation is like unto this great nation? And they will cast dust on their heads, and they will cry, weeping and wailing and saying, alas, alas, the great and mighty Babylon, wherein we were made rich by reason of her costliness, and in 1 hour she has been made desolate. Rejoice over her, thou heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. We're going to look today into the arsenal of the Lord, the weapons of his indignation, which are about to be used in 1 hour in the judgment of America, Babylon. Before we look at the weapons of indignation which God has created for this purpose, I just want to remind everybody, when does this happen? The prophecies are very clear in the writings of Jeremiah 29. And everybody loves to quote 29:11, for I know the thoughts that I think towards you, thoughts of peace and not evil, to give you an expected end. And this is the Lord speaking to his own and the expectation of their salvation. But everybody forgets the context, which begins in verse 10. For thus saith the Lord, after 70 years have expired, after the 70-year reign of end-time Babylon has expired upon the earth, I will visit you. The Lord is going to visit Babylon, and he's going to visit his people. And the visitation of the Lord brings the judgment of his indignation upon this ruined nation. Jeremiah 50 verse 27 declares, woe unto them, for their day has come, the time of their visitation. In visitation, the Lord brings judgment upon the wicked, destroying the wicked nations, and he also comes for deliverance of his people. We're going to look at these weapons of indignation today in some detail. I want to share with you today some detailed insight into the military capabilities of our enemies. I'm going to be looking at information presented in several books written by a Russian military analyst. His name is Andrei Martyanov, and he has published 3 books: Losing Military Supremacy, The Real Revolution in Military Affairs, and lastly, Disintegration, Indicators of the Coming American Collapse. And now, this is the opinion of a Russian military analyst, but his points are well articulated in going into great detail in the changing military balance of power. I'm going to start with a little bit of information from Losing Military Supremacy. The United States views itself as the lone superpower in the world, and most American citizens are convinced that our nation is unrivaled as a military power. As a result, most Americans believe the United States cannot be challenged, and that our nuclear deterrent somehow ensures that we would never be attacked by a peer nation such as Russia or China. Martyanov writes, America's biggest problem is U.S. forces have not fought in a communications-degraded environment for decades. Therefore, they don't know how to do it. America lacks not only tactics and techniques and procedures, but even the training to fight in a comms-degraded environment. In fact, the United States military has not fought any adversary which could provide a serious fire response on the ground, in the air, or by water since World War II. What awaits the United States will look a lot like the events of America's involvement in World War I. In the first 110 days of fighting on the ground in France, the U.S. Army sustained 300,000 casualties, including 110,000 killed in action. And that's a picture of the lethality that awaits U.S. forces in a future war facing a peer adversary with real armies, modern air defenses, and state-of-the-art naval power. Ignoring this reality is the road to defeat. It's time for America to look beyond the images of Hollywood movies and fictional military stories to address the devastating firepower that confronts U.S. forces. Not only have hypersonic weapons changed the military balance of power, but they've also changed the dimensions of the battlefield itself. Today, the U.S. military will be confronted with the grim reality of literal attacks in its staging areas, attacks on rear supply facilities, attacks on the lines of communication, involving massive salvos of long-range, high subsonic, supersonic, and hypersonic missiles. The U.S. military has never encountered such a paradigm in its history. Moreover, already today, the lower 48 states are not immune from conventional, massive missile attack. Other military analysts have commented, we don't think the Americans are nearly as good as they think they are. They've been spoiled by success, initial success that is, against second and third-rate enemies, which they swiftly overwhelmed by their air power and their technical weapons. Overwhelmed in the first few weeks, and after that it's a different story. Russia's state-of-the-art hypersonic missiles have a tactical range of 1,000 or more miles, and as standoff weapons are capable of reaching most U.S. military assets in any region beyond the range of U.S. defensive capabilities. No carrier battle group, no naval warship, no military base will be able to survive the onslaught of these long-range hypersonic weapons. An American conventional military thinking is based on the premise that conflict will begin with conventional forces and that the threat of mutual nuclear destruction will preclude the use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield. And such thinking is completely outdated. It's quite likely that the opposite will occur. Russian strategists will use their most lethal weapons first, before the United States even has the opportunity to respond. Russia's fifth-generation weapons, hypersonic missiles, Armata tank, the Samad ICBMs. The United States has no defensive countermeasures, and there is no air defense for the U.S. mainland. It simply doesn't exist. The day of reckoning is upon us. Nobody's quaking in their boots anymore, Pat Buchanan quoted. The problem with the U.S. military goes even deeper than these technical deficiencies. U.S. forces are being thinly stretched and subjected to mindless demoralization from social experimentation on the troops. The focus on critical race theory and transgender inclusionism is degrading morale deeply. And in the background, the United States faces both moral and economic bankruptcy. Our nation has been living on borrowed time. It's been borrowing to sustain its prosperity, and in the process has bankrupted itself financially, emotionally, and morally. Isn't it ironic how this shining city on a hill, which allegedly defeated Germany in 1918, and again Nazi Germany in 1945, and then won the Cold War in 1991, would end up 30 years later with its economy wrecked, its armed forces paralyzed, its political system in complete division, with American society becoming a very outrageous version of a Jerry Springer TV show, and with our American culture, if not altogether destroyed, now marginalized in the eyes of our younger generations as a form of white supremacy. Martianoff writes, today the United States doesn't even have a serious air defense system other than early warning infrastructure. We have no defense against missile attack from any direction. This is the new reality for America, which has gotten used to being able to easily and quickly overcome weak opposition through overwhelming technological military superiority. Americans need to wake up to the reality that we can no longer prevail against a peer adversary. And if we don't wake up, America will remain under the threat of a massive military miscalculation. Modern America is ill. She is not in a good place in any important metric which defines a prosperous or successful nation. Much more goes into success than meaningless Wall Street economic indices and the financial value of her investment markets denominated in fiat currency that is accelerating in its depreciation. It's difficult to explain to people who consider iPhones and other useless computer contraptions as some form of economic success, or who spend their time worrying about wasteful features on Facebook as something high-tech. The new smartphone and a marijuana-addicted generation is not an indicator of economic success because they can afford yet another new model of some electronic toy, while being increasingly less educated, less knowledgeable, and much less competent than the generation which preceded them. This younger generation is in the process of inheriting a country which over the last quarter century has lost most of its appeal in the eyes of the rest of the world as the bastion of democracy, human rights, or sound economic models, due to its hubris and its permanent wishful, delusional thinking. Today, any mention of American democracy or freedom of the press will create an ironic smile at best, sarcastic laughter at worst, all over the world. Where does this leave us? On the globe in general and in the U.S. in particular, there's no denying that the economic decline of America, both in relative and absolute terms, is in fact accelerating. America is being defined by a new world order, an order of liberal orthodoxy, which is creating a crisis in our country. No matter what the capitalized value of Facebook is, America cannot deliver the crucial and highly needed products and services without a strong manufacturing sector. No serious progress in scientific, educational, or other fields is likely. It also places a huge restraint on America's ability to develop military weapons, and as a result threatens our geopolitical standing globally. Few of the American weapons produced in the last quarter century produced any strong impression. Many of them simply do not work at all. The F-35 new stealth fighter bomber is capable of many things and is state-of-the-art in nothing. And America's military vulnerabilities have already been demonstrated to the world. In April of 2018, President Trump launched a cruise missile strike on facilities in Syria. Over 110 American Tomahawk cruise missiles were fired from naval platforms off the coast of Syria. The Russians and Syrians were not lying when they claimed to have shot down more than 70 of the US, UK, and French missiles. It would undermine the confidence of the American people in our supposedly invincible weapon systems if the White House were to have confirmed the fact the majority of these cruise missiles were destroyed in the air. But this is the reality of what happened. So far, the Russians have not pursued publishing this reality. Perhaps they're acting like a good poker player, not wanting to tip their hand nor alert the American people to the obsolescence of what was our state-of-the-art technology in the early 1990s. This is the new world in which we find ourselves, in which the technological dominance of the U.S. military, enjoyed over third world nations for the last 30 years, is now over. And looking to the future, the only adversary that the United States can expect to confront in military conflict is likely to be Russia or China. In 2018, Vladimir Putin addressed Russia's Federal Assembly, demonstrating and revealing to the world Russia's new fifth-generation state-of-the-art weapons systems. He made his message very clear when he said, "You didn't listen to us then. You will listen to us now." After which he proceeded to present a military technological version of Pearl Harbor meets Stalingrad. The information presented by Putin in 2018 establishes that the missile gap between U.S. and Russian forces is not only real, it's not just a gap, but it's a technological abyss. It's an abyss which American planners don't even wish to confront. For example, Russia's Sarmat ballistic missile, which we term Satan II, is capable of launching in near space warheads over the South Pole, which will be flying at hypersonic glide rates, Mach 20 and above. And they will come in under the radar. We won't even know they're above U.S. territory until they begin detonating. At most, we may have 1 or 2 minute warning. At the same time, Russia's hypersonic cruise missiles can be launched from naval platforms off the coast. This leaves our country with the reality of no effective defense for the lower 48. And in fact, our naval carrier battle groups have no effective defense either. These large, imposing, and expensive ships are defenseless against the new revolutionary weapons. The Zircon hypersonic missile, whose combined costs range somewhere of few tens of millions of dollars, can decimate tens of billions of dollars worth of naval hardware. We're left with the question, what is the value of America's military budget when billions and even hundreds of billions of dollars of our military assets can be destroyed in a matter of minutes by a hypersonic missile attack for which we have no effective defense? The arsenal of the Lord cannot be stopped. Following Putin's speech to the Federal Assembly, Martyanov wrote, the United States simply has no resources other than turning on the printing press and completely bankrupting itself in the process with which to counter Russia's military advantage. But here's the point. Russia knows this. And Putin's speech was not about directly threatening the U.S., which for all intents and purposes is now defenseless against Russia's military weapons. Martyanov writes that Russia does not have the objective of destroying the United States, but rather Russia's actions are the equivalent of pulling a gun on a drunk, rowdy, knife-wielding bully in a bar and get him to pay attention to the ramifications and personal dangers of his continued actions. It seems that this is the only way to deal with the United States today. He writes, America can no longer conduct wars on the cheap. Unless the United States wishes to unleash a nuclear holocaust, the era of American imperialism and American militarism is over. Though we're yet to see it, the end of that era is now assured. And is it not ironic that this era ends at exactly the end of America's 70-year rule as the reigning leader of the free world, and in the last 30 years, as the enshrined sole superpower of the earth? Once the veil of propaganda and myth is removed from America's military capabilities, what is left revealed is a nation state which, even if retaining its current rate of expansion of its military expenditures through the accumulation of additional national debt, will by the year 2030 have no discretionary spending power left. This is not a recipe for staying in a position of military leadership, where the U.S. has to maintain an immensely expensive naval surface fleet, which is useless against modern technology. Even today, America is forced to rely on older aircraft, the F-15 and the F-18 still being in service, with the F-35 fifth generation aircraft plagued with almost an unending list of technical problems and technical shortcomings, vulnerabilities that will manifest themselves in the first few hours of peer-to-peer conflict. All of these are the signs of a declining power, which for all intents and purposes has already lost the arms race for the new battlefield, despite maintaining an incredibly huge edifice of military power and continuing to advertise itself as the only superpower. The U.S. lost the Cold War because of its hubris and ultimately an inability to look into the future and change with it. At the foundation of this inability is a fundamental systemic crisis of liberalism inside America and its most dangerous iteration, the American version of globalism. A few final comments from Martyanov's book, Disintegration. If the United States has any future at all as a republic, it must address the incompetence and corruption of its political class. President Trump ran on a drain the swamp agenda. Today, it has become increasingly obvious the so-called swamp will stop at nothing to preserve its own power. Those of us who understand the prophetic fulfillment of this time realize that the swamp is actually controlled by the beast, and that the 10 kings who are about to rule the earth for 1 hour with the beast have already decided they're going to burn Babylon with fire. So the shortfalls in our technical capabilities, the obsolescence of our weapons, the lack of effective defense for our country, the open window of vulnerability was all left in place by design. The enemies of America are within, and the events of the coming world war will be used to collapse the current world system so that it can quickly be replaced with a one world government under the rule of the beast. Martyanov writes, if the United States preserves itself as a unified state, a doubtful proposition if one considers the speed with which a complete and systematic dysfunction has already divided the country, everything we knew about the United States will be gone, and the world will face an unstable third world geopolitical entity armed with nuclear weapons. placed in the middle of an internal power struggle, which may take an extremely violent form, with the ever-declining institutions of the American state unable to mitigate the unfolding catastrophe threatening to evolve into full-blown civil war, which will tear the United States apart, threaten the designation, and indeed the very existence of those today who identify themselves as Americans. What we're witnessing is a Balkanization of the United States. Robert Bork, who had been nominated for a position in the U.S. Supreme Court and who was blocked by the liberal Congress, warned of such 25 to 30 years ago. In multicultural societies, no matter what political creed they follow, are always threatened by impulses towards separatism and dissolution. We're witnessing not only an American tragedy, we are witnessing the tragedy of Western civilization, which has rejected the fundamental principles which defined Western civilization, reason and rational thought. Today, the United States is increasingly being exposed as a nation ruled by an oligarchy, or rather two ruling parties that are in fact one organism, in which the nation is no longer either a democracy nor a republic. Most international observers who watch the United States and study its politics and policies carefully have been aware of this reality for years. This has been a very poorly kept secret. Only the American public remains deceived by the red and blue pony show, which is the national theater of American politics, in which there's really only one rider on the white horse, presenting the same deception in both colors of red and blue. After the first debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, commentators observed, America long ago ceased functioning as a beacon of democratic values to which the world could look to for guidance and support. But the Trump-Biden debate exposed our true dysfunction. We are now little more than the laughingstock of the world, armed with nuclear weapons. If that does not scare you, nothing will. From the debacle in Iraq to the lost war of Afghanistan, to inspiring a slaughterhouse in Syria, to unleashing with the help of its NATO allies the war in Libya, to finally fomenting a coup and a war in Ukraine, all of this disastrous record of geopolitical, diplomatic, military, and intelligence incompetence speaks to the failure of American political, military, and academic institutions. If you assumed any of those events were designed to create and sustain the current world order. But if you understand behind the scenes, the forces of darkness have been using American power to create the chaos and destabilization of the current world order in order to allow the conflagration of the world leading up to and in the events of World War III in order to open the door for the one world government following the current system's collapse, then these strategies were brilliant. If America truly went into Iraq to create democracy, then our decision makers were idiots, sophomoric fools. There's no chance of democracy ruling in the Middle East in a language where the language itself, Arabic, has no word for liberty. Such would be the strategy of madmen. But if American forces were sent into the Middle East to overthrow the strongmen who were keeping a lid on Pandora's box so that we could literally destabilize the region, begin a series of wars that would force a massive migration of Arab refugees towards Europe and the rest of the world in order to begin to destabilize the cultures of all of these countries. The strategies in the Middle East were brilliant chess moves. In the New York Times, Thomas Friedman writes of the Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention, in which he argues countries with McDonald's franchises have never gone to war with each other. The humble and greasy American hamburger has been turned into a world-class symbol of America's successful middle class with too much to lose to countenance war. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union and our self-proclaimed victory in the Cold War, America's academic community unleashed onto an unsuspecting world an avalanche of triumphant fodder, which, like the preposterous Big Mac index, has lost all touch with reality. Martyanov also cites the moral degradation of the West. The real pedophilia of Western elites is now a well-established fact, demonstrated dramatically by the Jeffrey Epstein saga, which proved that the tradition of Western intellectuals and the powerful striving for underage children never went away. God promised that he would raise the skirts of America Babylon and that it would become a laughingstock to the nations. Well, so this has occurred right before our eyes. So here in the year 2021, with America's military effectively obsoleted, America's strategic defense vulnerable to surprise attack, America's military forces facing what will amount to a war of extermination, we now have a Democratic presidency, a Democratic-controlled Congress intent on spending us into oblivion. And the only hegemony of American power that remains is the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. And the U.S. dollar rests on the perceived power of America's military. We are one military defeat away from the collapse or the abandonment of the American dollar. And it's interesting that the Russian government formally abandoned the dollar several weeks ago. America's main export today is inflation. And in order to export inflation, America must maintain the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. As soon as we lose the dollar, we lose our ability to print money and export it through the trade deficit. Once the dollar is delisted or abandoned as the world's reserve currency, the trillions of dollars, at this point, in excess of $10 trillion having been exported from the United States, will suddenly rush to find a home. And it will cause dramatic inflation, destabilizing our domestic economy. When the myth of America's military dominance is finally revealed as nothing more than a modern-day version of the king with new clothes, the U.S. dollar will be abandoned. And with it, the U.S. economy will basically collapse. And that is the process that is ongoing right now. In the war that is coming, America's military will face a battlefield in which they are unqualified to operate. The outcome will be quite different than the latest Tom Clancy military fiction novel, in which U.S. forces always have the mythical upper hand. America's ignorance, even inability to learn from history following World War II, has led us to conclude utterly wrong lessons. The reality is that the United States has been acting as a colonial policeman over the last 70 years of its rule as the Chaldean state. It was the lion in control of the eagle's wings all along. And the eagle was used to serve one purpose, policing the colonies, or what were former colonies of the royal families of Europe. And in the same time, the United States was left defenseless for an express purpose. The real state of America's military balance of power is horrific. It's a well-known fact that the U.S. Air Force has been cannibalizing its own planes for spare parts for the last several years. While its newest aircraft, the F-35, in the words of one observer, is still a lemon. Today, the U.S. military-industrial complex continues to produce ridiculously expensive but altogether ineffective weapon systems, which become obsolete before they even leave the manufacturing floor. America's lagging behind in numerous areas of advanced missile technology, and this lag is not only huge, it's increasing. Alongside these technological deficiencies, there's been another crisis occurring in the background, a institutional rot which has affected the U.S. military, demoralizing and creating an intellectual collapse among the military elite and its officers, reaching an alarming scale. A letter written by a former professor at West Point basically said academic standards are almost non-existent. This trend started 10 years ago and has only gotten worse. Cadets routinely fail multiple classes but are pushed forward anyway. The academic collapse of America's military has been pointed out by several authors. In one study, Tim Bakken, a professor at West Point, writes about the collapse of the institution in his published work, The Cost of Loyalty, Dishonesty, Hubris, and Failure in the U.S. Military. Quoting Martyanov again, today, when one observes what happens in the so-called defense industry and in the Department of Defense within the United States, one cannot get rid of the sense of complete surrealism. From pictures of American servicemen made to wear high heels and pregnancy simulators so they could experience what women experience, to promotion of the most radical racial and sexual theories, to political extremism. This is not the American military that any of us used to know. The environment itself is becoming increasingly toxic and not conducive to acceptance of any military, technological, or geopolitical realities. No amount of preaching will address these increasingly disturbing problems unless America recognizes and reforms itself as a nation and builds an armed forces for the purpose of defending the homeland and not enriching the class of globalists who view America as merely a vehicle on their way to imposing an Orwellian reality upon the world, which America itself is becoming at an alarming rate. Jeremiah himself writes in chapter 51, verse 30, the mighty men of Babylon, the military of Babylon, America, have forborne to fight. They've remained in their holds. They've stayed hidden in the holes of the earth. Their power has failed. They have become as women. And so they've burned the dwelling place, and all of the bars of her power are broken. A sword is upon their horses and upon their chariots. And of all the mingled people, all of the diverse cultured people that are in the midst of America, a sword is upon them, and they shall become as women. And a sword will be upon her treasury, and they shall be robbed. And so we have been robbed. And so our military now is literally learning to become as women, wearing high heels and pregnancy simulators, while our nations prepare the arsenal of God's judgment upon us. The last point I want to address, which also Martyanov comments on in his book, is the fact that our culture itself is being destroyed. And I quote, today, neither France nor the United States are nations in the full meaning of the word. France has descended into the chaos of globalist, multicultural orthodoxy, while the United States is completely subverted by ethno-religious and corporate interests, which have run the U.S. military-industrial complex like a cash cow, which must provide profit margins and not the effective elimination of an enemy who can actually fight back. As long as a fairly defenseless country can be targeted for aggression and openly false threatening rationales can be presented for the delivery of American-made munitions and platforms, the going should be really good. But this is anything but the pursuit of a national interest. It is corporatism on a grand scale. Today, apart from exporting inflation and shoving increasingly inferior military technology down the throats of its allies in NATO, the United States does not act like a nation, but is a corporation which is being financed by a Ponzi scheme operating a massive money laundering operation. The main political doctrine of the United States is not a doctrine of winning wars, but rather of starting them. And so the rider on the white horse went forth to conquer and conquering. For it's better for the bottom line of its defense contractors if these wars never end. Lastly, the United States and the NATO nations which comprise our allies are all being systemically destroyed from within through the concept of multiculturalism. Western nations are incapable of assimilating other peoples. This is true of every nation. In so doing, the majority ethnicity of the empire, whether it be France or England, or what are today called whites in the U.S. are being subjected to what they regard and resent as reverse discrimination and suffocating political correctness and censure. Steve Sailer published in 2005 a book entitled Invade the World, Invite the World, in which he described the strategy of first attacking a country and then encouraging its refugees to seek asylum in the West, degrading the cultures of all of the Western nations. This agenda of neoliberalism is really a globalist strategy to weaken the cultural identity of all of the Western nations. The forces of globalism are anti-national in principle, and so they must destroy the common cultures of all Western nations before those nations can be destroyed themselves. The so-called progressive agenda now being implemented wholesale across the United States is destroying the cultural framework of our country. Future American generations may end up completely divorced from the American culture that we were born into and that we grew up under. The progressive left, wittingly or not, is doing the heavy lifting for totalitarian globalist forces, which are in the business of re-engineering not only the United States, but all of the Western world. The scaffolding of American society is collapsing. The woke and cancel culture is winning. This is the tragic end of our nation, and it is unfolding right before our eyes. And America's elites, badly educated and mesmerized by decades of their own propaganda, which they now accept as reality, have become arrogant and incompetent as much as corrupt. There are no viable ideas or solutions to any of America's unfolding economic, social, or cultural problems that can originate from our elite political class, who see the world only through a Wall Street or a New York Times lens. Real intellect, courage, and integrity are simply not there. Of course, the United States is still capable of starting wars. And as we are currently watching events in the Black Sea and surrounding Ukraine, it appears NATO is intent upon confronting Russia itself, and in the very near future. If we are successful in initiating a war with Russia, it'll mean only one thing: the fulfillment of Revelation 17 and 18 and the end of America itself. It's difficult for America's political elite to accept the fact that the nation has basically painted itself into a corner. Today, America's primary economic strategy is continued deindustrialization, to a degree that the only path left for us to take is further financialization of the entire country. And this will merely postpone and aggravate the ultimate and inevitable collapse. The American political elite ride a one-trick pony. The rider on the white horse is left with only further currency debasement, further financialization, and there's no way to stem the tide. To control a population of deplorables, especially those who are anguished by the political counterculture now driving the agenda of the United States, the elites will deploy their propaganda machine to continue to attack America's cultural foundations. Martianoff writes, "Is the United States even a nation? At present, the U.S. is split in the core. Our nation has now been permanently divided, irreparably damaged, and is literally in the death throes of its final hours. There is no longer a United States of America. We are simply the divided and soon to be destroyed States of America. The white Christian populations that are the majority of America's rural states have nothing in common with the radicalized liberals of the blue cities. The only way to maintain control over a disintegrating national population is to engage in greater and greater forms of tyranny. While drug-dependent Americans can no longer work in a complex, high-tech manufacturing field, Continued American deindustrialization will go hand in hand with the removal of large segments of American youth from anything of a qualified labor pool. Their life expectancy is declining, and their dying out is viewed as helping the U.S. economy. The political tyranny will start with demolishing the U.S. Constitution, transitioning the country to a one-party state with political purges sure to follow the transition. In a country where half the population believed that President Trump was Russia's Manchurian candidate, where the media was singing with a single voice promoting the same fantasy, and where most universities define human nature as a social construction, where people who have zero background in technical fields such as physics, mathematics, or chemistry are driving the green energy field. In such a country, nothing is impossible. But such a country will disintegrate inevitably because it is unsustainable. The United States, as it used to be known, has no future, especially with its current globalist elites running not only foreign policy, but in complete control of the mainstream media and its dominant technical or high-tech corporations who control the consensus of what was once free speech in this land. The United States doesn't even exist as a nation anymore. Not even close. And if the magnificence and power through visual representation of the nation's cathedrals is any indication, the United States has become a tasteless, boxy, postmodernist megachurch preaching a fake prosperity gospel. It is all fake. It always was, and it cannot stop the disintegration of this nation, because in the end, it is the spirit of the nation and of its people which decides the outcome, even when everything seems lost. Whether America will find the spirit to survive remains to be seen, but in the end, it is the only way America will preserve itself as a unified country and stop the disintegration. Everything else will follow from there. And we know from the Bible prophecies of this hour that a remnant will emerge. A remnant of people will survive. And this remnant will turn back to the faith of our fathers, turn back to the God of the Bible, turn back to faith in the name of Jesus. And that remnant people will have the faith to survive. They'll have the faith to endure. And out of this nation will come the eagle's wings. What will be left of America and her eagle's wings, as pictured in Scripture in Daniel chapter 7, will be given to the woman who will be fleeing from the conquest of the beast. And so we will assist the move, the exodus, if you will, of the remnant at the time of the end to the place of hiding in the wilderness, as we will await the final fulfillment of the prophecies of the Lord. Well, God bless you. Thank you for listening. I was trying to share with you some insight into the realities of the arsenal of the Lord, which now are readied for the day that is come. The 70 years of America Babylon have ended. Now we await the visitation of the Lord. The 7 weeks prophecy of Daniel 9, verses 24 to 27 have concluded. We are awaiting the birth of the man-child of Revelation 12. We're awaiting the appearance of the prince. We're awaiting the manifestation of all things. And in this time of waiting, brothers and sisters, go into your prayer closets, close the doors behind you, and seek the Lord while he still may be found. God bless you all. Thank you for listening. This is Benjamin Baruch saying shalom.